You're 34, you've got a decent job, maybe a partner, maybe a mortgage, maybe a kid or two, and somewhere in the last few years, without a single dramatic decision, your financial habits quietly stopped being temporary and started being permanent. Here's the specific claim I want to make in the next 15 minutes, and I'll back all of it up. The way you handle money right now in your 30s isn't just describing your current situation. For most people, it's setting the actual default settings your finances will run on for the next 20, 30, 40 years. Not because you consciously decided that, but because of exactly how habits lock in during this particular decade of life. Your 20s were experimental. Nobody expected you to have it figured out. Your 50s, we've talked about in this series, come with their own specific risks. But your 30s are different from both. This is the decade where figuring it out quietly turns into this is just how I am with money, and almost nobody notices the exact moment that switch flips. I want to show you where that switch is, and more importantly, how to make sure it flips toward the version of you that you'd actually choose, not just the one you drifted into. Let's start with the mechanism, because this isn't random, and it isn't really about willpower. Psychologists who study habit formation point to something specific about early to mid-adulthood. This is when life's structural variables, career, relationship status, housing, family size, start stabilizing after years of change. And habits, financial ones included, don't form in chaos. They form in repetition. The same decision, made the same way, often enough times that it stops requiring conscious thought at all. In your 20s, everything was shifting too fast for most financial patterns to fully cement. New jobs, new cities, new relationship statuses, new living situations. There wasn't enough repetition of sameness for autopilot to take over. But by your 30s, for most people, the variables settle. Same job or a similar one. Same city, same partner, same monthly bills, roughly, month after month. And that stability, which feels like a good thing and mostly is also exactly the condition under which financial behavior stops being a decision and starts being a default. This is why the specific way you handle a paycheck at 33 tends to still be roughly how you handle it at 43, unless something forces a deliberate interruption. Not because you can't change, because nothing about ordinary life naturally prompts you to. I want to make this concrete, because habits are forming can sound abstract until you see the specific shapes it tends to take in this decade. The first is what I'd call comparison compression. Your 30s are the first decade where your peer group's financial lives become genuinely visible through social media, through friends buying houses, through the group chat where someone mentions their new car. In your 20s, everyone looked roughly the same broke. By your 30s, the visible gaps start appearing, and they compress your sense of normal into whatever your specific visible circle happens to be doing, regardless of whether that circle represents anything typical at all. This compression quietly recalibrates what feels like a reasonable purchase, a reasonable house size, a reasonable amount of debt, not based on your actual numbers, but based on a distorted sample of people whose finances you can't actually see the full picture of. The second is the default lock-in itself. Whatever percentage of your paycheck you're currently saving, whether that's a deliberate 7% into a retirement account or an accidental 0% because you never got around to setting it up, tends to become the number that just continues. Not because you decided it should stay that number forever, because changing a default requires an active decision, and active decisions require attention, and attention is a limited resource that life in your 30s is already spending on career, relationships, and often small children who are extremely good at consuming all remaining attention. The third is timeline anxiety, and this one's specific to this decade. Somewhere in your 30s, retirement stops being a hypothetical and starts being a math problem you can actually calculate. And for a lot of people, that first real calculation is unsettling. Not because the math is necessarily bad, but because it's the first time the number has felt concrete instead of abstract. That anxiety, left unexamined, tends to push people toward one of two unhelpful extremes. Either avoidance, not looking at the number again for years because it was uncomfortable once, or overcorrection, making dramatic, poorly researched moves specifically to make the anxious feeling go away quickly, which isn't the same thing as making a good decision. And the fourth is what I'd call obligation spending, the specific category of expenses that shows up heavily in this decade and almost nowhere else. Weddings, baby showers, housewarmings, milestone birthdays for a widening circle of friends and family who are all hitting these moments at roughly the same time you are. Individually, each one feels small and non-negotiable. Collectively, this decade tends to carry a specific, rarely budgeted for expense category that quietly competes with saving, precisely because it doesn't feel like spending in the way a want does. It feels like an obligation, and obligations don't get the same scrutiny that wants do. Here's the part worth sitting with, because it's the same reason this pattern is so easy to miss. None of this feels like a financial decision while it's happening. It feels like life. Nobody in their 30s sits down and consciously decides, I will now let my savings rate become permanent, or I will now calibrate my spending to my most visible friends instead of my own numbers. These patterns form through dozens of individually reasonable moments. Going to the wedding, keeping the same 401k contribution you set up on your first day at a new job 3 years ago, not revisiting a number that made you anxious once. And the cumulative effect is largely invisible until you look back at 45 and realize the version of you that exists financially was mostly assembled on autopilot during a decade you don't remember making many active decisions in at all. This is different from the pattern in your 40s, which is driven by overconfidence from real wins. This is driven by something quieter, the simple mechanics of what happens to financial behavior once life stabilizes enough for repetition to take over. It's not a mistake, it's closer to gravity. So knowing that your 30s are quietly locking in defaults you'll likely run on for decades, what actually works to make sure those defaults are the ones you choose on purpose? First, set your savings rate deliberately before life stabilizes around whatever number you happen to have right now. If you already have a number, don't just accept it as fine by default. Actively decide once whether it's the number you'd choose if you were setting it fresh today. Then automate it so the deliberate version becomes the new default, instead of leaving the accidental version to keep running quietly in the background. Second, separate your visible comparison circle from your actual financial planning. This doesn't mean ignoring what friends are doing. It means explicitly noticing when a purchase decision is being driven by your own numbers versus by a compressed, distorted sample of other people's highlight reels. A useful practice. Before a comparison-driven purchase, ask directly whether you'd still want it if no one in your circle had it first. Third, run the real retirement math now, on purpose, instead of avoiding it after one uncomfortable glance. The anxiety from that first calculation tends to fade significantly once it becomes a familiar, regularly updated number instead of a single unsettling moment you're avoiding revisiting. Familiarity turns an anxiety trigger into an ordinary piece of information. Fourth, budget explicitly for obligation spending instead of letting it compete invisibly with saving. Give this category of expense, weddings, gifts, milestone events, an actual planned amount each year based on realistic expectations for this stage of life. Once it's planned for, it stops functioning as a recurring, unplanned leak that quietly erodes whatever you thought your savings rate was. None of these four things require dramatic life changes or becoming a different kind of person. They require one deliberate look at defaults that are, right now, quietly becoming permanent whether you look at them or not. Here's what's actually worth remembering about this decade. Your 30s aren't dangerous because you're careless. They're formative in a very literal mechanical sense. This is simply when life stabilizes enough for financial habits to stop being temporary experiments and start being the operating system you'll likely run on for a long time, unless you interrupt it on purpose. The goal isn't to overhaul everything about how you handle money this week. It's to take one honest look at what's quietly becoming your default. While it's still early enough to redirect it deliberately instead of discovering it fully locked in a decade from now. If you're in your 30s right now, I want to know, in the comments, tell me honestly, when's the last time you actually looked at your savings rate on purpose instead of just letting it run in the background? I read every comment, and I think a lot of us are going to realize it's been longer than we'd like to admit. This is part of an ongoing series here on Quiet Wealth, where we look at the quiet decades that shape money more than any single decision does. If this helped you see your own 30s a little more clearly, subscribe. There's more of this coming. Thanks for spending this quiet 15 minutes with me. I'll see you in the next one.